I think we started the day off with a bang. We're greatly appreciative that we've got another all-star here waiting in the wings to speak. I've known Mike Vickers not directly I've known him professionally for quite a while. And he's, I don't know what to use the word legend, but he's certainly someone that has played a role in history. And this year he's going to be coming out, next year, 2018, is going to be coming out with a new book. His biography is coming out, and I think it's going to be revealing, and he'll be a lot in the news. He's widely regarded as one of the nation's top national security professionals. When we were preparing this presentation today, I was communicating with the White House. The White House was asking, is Mike Vickers going to be in the room? And I said, yes, he will be here. And so his reputation is very wide and immense. He's served in so many different capacities, and you have his biography, but most recently he served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Chief Executive Officer of the Defense Intelligence Enterprise, and he served in so many different positions, ranging from intelligence to also special operations, directing those efforts in the Pentagon. He's actually served in the field as a special forces person. I think the thing that Mike is very proud of, and I think that deserves a lot of attention, is that he, if you Google it on the internet, there's a great video about his life. And this year he was a recipient of the William J. Donovan Award. This award is presented annually by the OSS Society. There's a great depiction of him and his life there that I really encourage you to watch and look at. Previous William J. Donovan Award winners were Alan Dulles, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Earl Mountbatten of Burma. It's a long and honorable list, and now Mike's name is added to that. And I think the most important thing, in my opinion, that he played a role in history is, if you've ever seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, I recommend that you catch it. But Michael is one of the people that drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan. So I think that is really something that, and I guess there's bad news and some good news here in that. The bad news is for Moscow is that Mike thinks he's got one more round in him to serve in the government. So if Russia, I think, needs to be very careful about what it does in Ukraine, because we still have Mike Vickers. So, Michael, I'm turning the floor over to you.
Well, thanks, Glenn, for that unusual introduction. But it really is a great pleasure to be with you all here this morning and participate in Jamestown's 11th Annual Counterterrorism Conference. It's quite daunting to follow my friend H.R. McMaster. During these turbulent times, I think having professionals like H.R. and Secretary Mattis, our country is very fortunate. And if this is the deep state, all I can say is give me more of it. So what I thought I'd do this morning, the rest of the day, you're going to hear from experts about the state and dynamics of the Salafi jihadi movement, and so I'm not going to try to replicate that. Instead, what I'm going to try to do in 20 minutes or so is we're now in our 17th year of our war with Al-Qaeda, its allies, and its offshoots like ISIS. And so as someone who has been intimately involved in this conflict as a policymaker and intelligence community leader across 2 administrations, I thought I'd share some thoughts about what's made this our longest war, what's worked and what hasn't from the point of view of U.S. strategy, and where do we go from here. So let me start with the notion of why is this war so darn long? Well, first, I think if you look at the momentum shifts that have occurred since the war began, which I describe as across 6 rounds, you see its kind of non-linearity inherent in the unconventional nature of the war. Campaigns really haven't accumulated as they do in conventional warfare. You know, you win the Battle of Atlantic, then you can invade Europe in World War II, et cetera. That really hasn't played out. So if you look at round one, which was really, as our former Secretary of State Condi Rice said, you know, Al-Qaeda was at war with us before we were at war with them. But if you date it from when we really entered the war on the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda clearly won round one, which is really the 90s, the attacks in the 90s through the 9/11 attacks. Round two, then, we counterpunched, and counterpunched very effectively, seized the initiative in Afghanistan, did a number of captures in of Al-Qaeda senior leaders, principally in Pakistan-settled areas, but really across the world. We started forming what I've described as our global counterterrorism network, our array of partners around the world that really help us disrupt plots before they can really germinate. But then the period of round three, 2003 to 2006, we got bogged down in Iraq. We had Al-Qaeda and the Taliban reconstitute in Pakistan's border regions. We had a peace agreement in 2006 between Pakistan and militant groups in the frontier region of Pakistan, and that benefited Al-Qaeda. And the result, Al-Qaeda expanded its franchises for the first time. By 2006, it had gone from an organization with global reach to one with semi-global presence. And perhaps you all remember we had the transatlantic plot, which we fortunately broke up, but where they were going to blow up 10 airliners in a repeat of 9/11 over the Atlantic Ocean. So again, rounds 1 and 3 went to Al-Qaeda, round 2 to the United States, and you see the momentum shift. Round 4, which I described between 2006 and 2011, was really a good round for the United States and its partners. Saudi Arabia had been under siege 2003, 2004. By a few years later, they had done a very good job on counterterrorism and had stabilized the threat to the kingdom. We had the Iraq surge, which turned around the Iraq War. President Bush initiated a far more comprehensive and aggressive counterterrorism campaign to go after Al-Qaeda sanctuaries in the Pakistan border region with great results, which President Obama continued during his first term. We had the Afghanistan surge beginning in late 2009 through 2012. And then, of course, the Osama bin Laden raid, and then the killing through a drone strike of Anwar al-Awlaki, probably one of the most dangerous terrorists in the world, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And there were some setbacks during that period. Pakistan started to grow a little more distant from us toward the very end of that period, and that continued into the following. And then you see the war shift back the other way, 2011 to 2016. 2011, you have the Arab Spring, which otherwise known as Al-Qaeda Spring, but it really opened up a lot of space for the global jihadists and their allies. So Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula went from a fairly small organization to one 10 times the size in a few months. Of course, you had the beginnings of the civil war in Syria. We had the intervention in Libya, and then the instability there afterwards. And then we had the gradual resurgence of what had become ISIS, first in Syria and then in Iraq, and obviously culminating in 2014 with their takeover over much of the territory of northern Iraq. We had Boko Haram rise in Nigeria, conditions, the situation deteriorating in both Pakistan and Afghanistan until Pakistan military went into the frontier areas toward the end of this period, and then attacks in Europe and the United States. So we saw a lot of our gains rolled back, things that we'd achieved by the surges in Iraq and Afghanistan. In our big wars, we saw the global jihadists open new theaters, and take advantage of the expanded operating space that Arab Spring provided for them. We had some successes in reversing takeover of northern Mali and the Trans-Sahel and in Somalia, but round 5 clearly went to the global jihadists. And then the final round that brings us up to the present, 2016 and 17, we've had ISIS's loss of its physical caliphate, or core portion of its physical caliphate, and more success in Libya and in Yemen of recently and Somalia. But on the flip side, we've had continued inspired attacks and a continued terrorist threat, which is why we're concerned about threats to aviation to this day. So round 6 went to the U.S., and that's where I think we are in the conflict. Now, through this period, the U.S. has accrued strength despite this seesawing of the conflict, by hardening its defenses. It's made catastrophic attacks harder to do. It's built up its intelligence capabilities rather dramatically, something we did during the Reagan buildup, and we did the same thing after 9/11, and it is still paying big dividends against the global threats today. We really invented protracted or sustained counterterrorism warfare. We transformed our organizations in the Department of Defense and in the intelligence community. We've developed capabilities and operations to do the most precise air campaign in history with our so-called drones. We further expanded our global counterterrorism network. I would add that, as a policymaker for the bin Laden raid, some of the key capabilities that we had in 2011, we didn't have a few years before, that I wouldn't say totally made the raid possible, but dramatically contributed to it. And so shows the progress that we made. And of course, the big objective of U.S. foreign policy, preventing another 9/11 attack, has been achieved. But despite this, and despite the loss of ISIS's physical caliphate and accruing U.S. strength, there's no sign of this war ending. And I'd like to suggest to you 7 factors that lead to protracted conflict. The first, defeating insurgencies always take time. If you look across insurgencies, they range from 10 years to multi-decades. And this is a global insurgency. The way to think of the global jihadists is both as terrorist groups, but also as part of a global movement with expanded space and therefore expanded time. It's also more ideologically motivated than, it's kind of at the end of the bell curve on insurgencies in that regard, as religious wars tend to be. And so that kind of ideology is the hardest to defeat, and it's shorn up by grievances about U.S. presence in the Middle East and other things. Third, it's very cost effective. 9/11 attacks cost $500,000 to pull off. So it doesn't take a lot of money. And so you can cut off a lot of terrorist financing by kidnapping a diplomat or two. They make it up pretty quickly. Fourth, they have pretty robust allies, local insurgents, and allies, I would add, both active and passive, and then a passive population that at least gives tacit encouragement and some support, and occasionally those allies provide them with sanctuary. And then fifth, it's the instability. The Middle East is undergoing historic change. The space for ungoverned areas has doubled in the past few years. The Middle East is also racked by sectarian conflict and regional power rivalry, and the Middle East is fragmenting into different spheres. All that is good for global jihadists. And then the sixth factor is technology. One of the things that have allowed ISIS to shift to inspired attacks and extend their global reach is the advent of social media, and then commercial encryption has dramatically improved their operational security. And then finally, defeating these terrorist organizations isn't the only thing the United States and its partners have to do. We also have great power challenges, China and Russia, regional power challenges, North Korea and Iran, you know, what I describe as a new national security era that we've entered into, which is the fusion of the problems besetting the Middle East and great power and regional power competition. So we shouldn't be surprised, given these conditions, not only that this will be a protracted conflict, it may ebb and flow, there may be periods where we drive organizations down to low levels, but it will persist, and we shouldn't be surprised when we see a global jihad 3.0. You know, if Al-Qaeda was 1.0 and ISIS 2.0, there will be someone else to pick up the mantle. It's, as I mentioned, it's much easier to dismantle an organization, and that's not trivial, than it is to dismantle the ideology or the conditions that give rise to it, and that's going to be with us for a long time. So let me now turn for a few minutes to what's worked and what hasn't in our strategy since 9/11. So 5 interrelated elements, I would argue, have really proven most successful in our counterterrorism strategy. The first, the simple one, is hardening our defenses. You know, and particularly, you know, the simple thing of locks on aircraft doors, you know, after 9/11. We've made it a lot tougher for terrorists to do catastrophic attacks. That hasn't ended the competition. They continue to innovate. That's why we have these airline scares from time to time with, you know, non-metallic bombs and all that sort of thing. But we've made it a lot tougher for them to do that. Related to that, both at the operational level and then the strategic disruption level, is the central importance of intelligence. Global intelligence with our partners, domestic intelligence here in the United States, and then various forms of clandestine intelligence against these organizations. That has enabled our precision air campaign and our special operations campaigns. It's enabled a lot of arrests, and both domestically and overseas, breaking up plots, and that's really a centerpiece to our operations. The third thing that has worked is sustained but intense precision air campaigns, and again, principally with the Predator in areas, Pakistan, and to a lesser extent in Yemen. What we've seen is when our operational tempo reaches a high enough level where an organization can operate, as it did in 2010 and 2011. We were essentially doing strikes essentially every other day, or even more than that. The organization had no ability to respond, and so they just went to ground. Al-Qaeda's top leaders at the time, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, directed that they just try to wait out the strikes. When you do 1 strike a week or 2 strikes a week, you end up killing some leaders, but the organization itself can still function once they get used to that tempo. And so, you know, mass has it's but the combination of both mass, tempo, and precision that really makes it work. And I have to say, I applaud recent decisions the administration has made about moving us back a bit toward what's worked in the past on the use of precision air. The fourth factor is fully enabled advise and assist from our Afghan campaign in 2001, where we brought U.S. strengths to bear with local indigenous forces, and we've done it at a few other locations. When we have backed off from that, when we don't allow U.S. advisors to do more than train, we've gotten much less satisfactory results. And then the fifth that I've mentioned has really been this global counterterrorism network of partners that has allowed us to arrest terrorists all around the world with intelligence, really extending our reach. So what hasn't worked? 4 basic strategies. Containment, which was our pre-9/11 strategy, failed miserably, obviously. The strategy of transforming the Middle East through nation building and others, that may work over a generation. It really hasn't been able to work in the time frames that we had hoped it would. Having counterterrorism strategies in isolation, which I call strategic myopia. So for example, in Yemen, We had a very focused counterterrorism strategy on al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and to a large extent ignored the Houthi threat, the Iranian-supported Houthi threat that ended up taking over the country. So as a consequence, we lost our great counterterrorism partner in Yemen. Our counterterrorism efforts were set back, but also our strategic interests in the region. I would argue the same thing happened in Syria, where besides a very dire counterterrorism threat that had emerged in Syria, there was also regional conflict, civil war, great power intervention. There were a lot of other conflicts going on as well, and not seeing that as a part of a larger battle shaping the Middle East, I think, has resulted in less than the strategic effectiveness we would like. And then finally, also related to Syria, reliance on dubious partners. I think, we kind of made a deal with the devil with the Russians in Syria, and essentially we've given the Iranians, Lebanese, Hezbollah, and the Russians kind of a pass in that area, and I don't think it bodes well for the future. So let me conclude with where do we go from here? I have three basic things to offer. The first, obviously, is to really focus on what's worked, and then among the list of what hasn't worked, not to repeat those mistakes, but also those that you can correct. For example, the CT counterterrorism strategies in isolation is really a critically related policy choice that certainly would pay off. The second point I'd like to make is grounding our strategy. This relates to some of our strategic failures in the Middle East as it is, not as we wish it to be, not as we hope it will be a generation from now. The fundamental thing that has really eluded us strategically in the Middle East is trying to induce stability in a region that is getting more instability. So we've had a lot of success at what we call the tactical and operational levels of war. We've not had that success at the strategic level where we can make these gains stick. And then the final point is to adapt to the evolving threat. And again, Dr. Hoffman and others will touch on that. But as we've moved more toward inspired attacks, it places more of a premium on domestic intelligence and security. The FBI had been really stretched with cases in every state the past couple years, and that's something I think for our policymakers to look at. So I think I've hit the time on the nose, and with that, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much. Michael, that's I think a great overview of the whole discussion and the problems that we face, and you've really wrapped that up. I wanted to ask you a question that came up about, there was a gentleman here who asked a question about ideology and how we combat it. And are you still here? There he is. Yeah. I wanted to ask you that question. Right here, this gentleman right here raise your hand again. Right there. And please identify yourself. You had an excellent question earlier.
I'm Sam Wyman from Jefferson Waterman International. Mike, you and
I remember.
Chatted years ago.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah.
Good to see you. Excuse me. General McMaster talked about the importance of combating the ideology that recruits the impressionable. And you have made the same point here again. How do we deal with the ideology? What measures, what programs, what initiatives can be undertaken, or be thought about at least, to get at those efforts that keep people going against us? How do we identify the issues and counteract those issues? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So this is our most difficult strategic problem. It's something that very early on in the Bush administration, we identified as a center of gravity. It's one thing to identify it, it's another thing to really attack and defeat it. And so I think the challenge is, as I mentioned, you can disrupt and dismantle and even defeat specific organizations, although that takes time. defeating the ideology that gives rise to them, and then, or lets them reconstitute, or new organizations to take their place, is much harder unless you change the grievances, the underlying conditions, which is a very, very daunting problem. So both direct and indirect approaches need to be brought to bear on this. Where we failed the most is when we've tried to basically rely on, don't you want to be like us? The West is great. Copy our institutions and ideals. That doesn't address their grievances. They just see that as another form of cultural imperialism. And again, you're dealing with a very, very small segment of the population that is radicalized, but then there's a lot of passive supporters that still share those grievances, even if they don't go to violence. So actually amplifying regional voices, sometimes through covert means, sometimes through overt means, we've had more success where they can carry the debate themselves. We're not going to speak for them, but they can have the debates about whether global jihadism is the right solution to their problems, etc. One can also sow dissension in jihadist groups. There's a lot of things you can do at the tactical and operational level that don't necessarily win the conflict, but do help you in your campaigns. And then also related to the broader campaigns. As we've seen, as we've tracked ideological perspectives over the past couple decades, with the 9/11 attacks, support for Al-Qaeda went way up across a lot of the Islamic world. After we overthrew the regime in 01, 02, it was, who were those bums? Why did we believe in them? Et cetera. As they, with the ebbs and flows of the conflict, you saw ideological support never go down to too low a level, but basically mirror who they thought was winning. And so it's more than just the ideological struggle. It's the whole campaign. Ultimately, what I've tried to say is, our pillars in this strategy is really very targeted development assistance, our intelligence and working with our partners, and our special operations forces that enable those partners given the distributed threat. The development assistance is really, really critical. The challenge we've had is getting it into the real frontier areas where there's no security. Most of it goes through capitals, and it's hard to reach into the hinterlands, and that's where you want to affect. So HR talked about the broader problems to our national security. I would argue the information battle space, as we saw with Russian covert influence and others, has assumed an importance in national security strategy that it really hasn't since some of the early decades of the Cold War. And it's something we have to take seriously as a government and how we organize ourselves and combat it.
So how do you, following that on further, how do we do that? I mean, how do we combat this? They've created a global engagement center at State Department. It's been given $80 million to do this. In the Cold War, we had USIA doing it, and we got rid of it. Now it's just we had this information battle space, not only with dealing with jihadist threats, but also dealing, with the Russians and that information space, Chinese as well. So where in the government, what do we need as a government? Is this something in the NSC? Is there need to be a public and private face, a coordinator, some czar for this? I mean, does it create another position to deal with the problem? I mean, you've seen this from inside and outside the government.
Yeah, so there's not one approach that fits all. The Russian threat is very, very different in the Chinese than the global jihadist, but I would not favor one agency doing this. I think that you do need strategic direction from the NSC. Again, if you look at our early Cold War experience, that's precisely what we did. The NSC paid a lot of attention to this stuff. And then various institutions in state and USIA and CIA, et cetera, you bring those to bear together in a coordinated strategy. But I don't think the answer is a global engagement center or USIA. You need all of those things together, because as I said, sometimes Covert mechanisms work better than overt mechanisms. They can't supplant them, but in certain circumstances, they do a better job, and you need all of them working.
So what you would say maybe is they need an information czar at the NSC to kind of oversee and direct this whole.
I don't like the word czar, but you
Okay.
certainly need a very senior official.
How about
Yeah.
Putty
Yeah,
Shah?
you know, I mean, yeah.
That's certainly in the Russian
The
context
world could
as a
do with
negative.
fewer czars, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go here, yes, another question from here, this young lady.
Thank you very much. I'm interested by your comment that the Arab Spring was the equivalent of the Al-Qaeda Spring. I'm Louise Oliver, the former U.S. ambassador to UNESCO. When I was at UNESCO, that was the period when former President George Bush did his big democracy promotion. And the democracy promotion was problematic right in the beginning because the way they talked about it, if a country had an election, it was by definition a democracy, forgetting that, of course, rule of law, other institutions
Right.
need to support those things. An election is just the beginning.
Right.
What interests me is that when the Arab Spring started, there was all kinds of enthusiasm and acclamation that this was the beginning of a democratic transformation of the Middle East. Clearly that was wrong. Can you explain a little bit why the professionals, why the experts all got it wrong?
Sure, and it's a great question. You characterized it exactly right. So first, things like political instability, and particularly region-wide, but even country-specific instability, is if not our hardest analytical problem in intelligence, it ranks right up there. And so you can point to lots of factors that will cause instability in the broader Middle East. You can't point to this regime is going to fall on this specific day and then it's going to spread to this country, et cetera, in this time frame. I mean, that's just beyond the scope of intelligence. So, you know, President Obama was disappointed with the intelligence community's performance on Arab Spring, and rightly so. I would just say, you know, there's not a secret you can steal to find out where that's going. It's just a tougher problem, and so you know, it's one we're going to struggle to get right. Once you actually see it unfolding, and particularly in country-specific circumstances, then U.S. intelligence can be a lot more supportive of policymakers on what's happening day to day and informing diplomacy. And then also the strategic trajectory, once it looks set, then the intelligence, I think, improves quite a bit. But that period of transition is just a rough one. And I think if you look at government transitions across the board, whether it, you know, it's the Ukrainian Revolution in 14 or others, they catch us by surprise, just inevitably do. And what was the second part? I mean, I kind of did my mea culpa why we screwed up, but
Question over here in the back.
I'm a professor of history at UMass Dartmouth up in Boston. And my question is, from a historical perspective, how would you rate the success of Obama's sort of a standoff approach to war, this sort of proxy surrogate approach to war during his 3 years of fighting ISIS, also under Trump? You know, how did Trump recalibrate this proxy approach to war? You know, Obama had a lot of criticism from Republicans for not being more proactive. You know, I think cerebral luminaries like Sarah Palin accused him of not, you know, putting enough troops on the ground and retrenchment. Was this approach to war successful? Should we have done more? And also, what's the future of Rojava and the Kurds in Syria in this context? Thank you.
So, you know, the indirect warfare relying on local ground forces has had great successes and also, you know, great failures and everything in between. And a lot depends on the peculiar circumstances involved and also the specific policies that we put in place. So as I said, if you're just training forces and then they're doing the fighting, that force may collapse on you, as we saw with the Iraqi army after a $25 billion investment, or the Yemeni forces collapse to political machinations and others. You know, we've had more success when we've had tightly coupled advisors with proxy forces. And then secondarily, when we can bring enabling U.S. capabilities, our strength and mobility and intelligence, to support those forces to give them advantage, we've had more success. Those are clear policy choices about what, you know, the reason you go into proxy war to begin with is because you don't think it merits American interest to have a large commitment of U.S. forces, and so you want other ground forces to do the fighting for you. And as I said, it can work under some circumstances, it can work and not. But if you carry that all the way to where you say, I'm only going to do this little bit for you, and they're probably not going to succeed. And so, you know, each case merits it. I think, you know, given our experience in the Middle East, administrations have been reluctant in this decade to have, you know, to have large commitments of U.S. forces. I think, you know, and given the distributed nature of the threat, I'm not sure it would, you know, again, if you put all your eggs in one basket in one country, Iraq or Afghanistan, you're not going to solve the broader regional problem anyway.
And how does the United States walk itself between his last part of his question about Rojava? How does the United States kind of disentangle itself from having supported the Kurds in eastern Syria and the fall of Raqqa and the rise of the YPG, and yet at the same time be an ally of Turkey? I mean, a NATO member state. So how do you, you know?
That's a you know, as HR said, you know, they're all tough questions. That's a particularly tough one because you have conflicting interests. You know, and we face this problem periodically in our history. You try to thread the needle, or you side with one side or the other, but with consequences. So.
Okay. I'm going to go this side of the room, just to be fair to the people on this side. This young man right here, raising his hand. Yes, you.
Okay. Sort of an insider question, I think. What can Jamestown do better to help with this process?
So I think quality analysis is important, and then particularly, you know, Jamestown, I think, serves two roles. One, you know, government officials read it, which is very good. It supplements what else they get. But also I think it informs public debate at various levels among elites here in Washington, you know, policy elites in and out of government. But also, if you're going to sustain protracted conflict and not, you know, you have to have an understanding of the threat. And so I think that's critically important in a democracy. And Jamestown is unique in its focus on the areas that it focuses on, functionally as well as geographically, compared to other think tanks that I've seen around in Washington that really fill that niche.
Thank you. That's a great plug. Well, let's, you guys, okay. So I'll let you guys arm wrestle over who's going to answer.
Michael Kavuk, John White and Case. How much damage did our disastrous intervention in Libya do to the war on terror, and what's your assessment of the current situation there?
So I don't think it was on the scale of Iraq, but I do. You know, it opened another front. You know, what happened before was a lot of Libyan extremists joined al-Qaeda, but they exported a lot of their problem. And so, you know, a lot of the fiercest Libyan extremist fighters were in Pakistan and elsewhere, much like, you know, al-Qaeda is a multinational organization. You Chechens, all kinds of different nationalities. And the air campaign and limited indirect ground campaign to topple Gaddafi then left a vacuum that we really didn't fill. And that's been a continuing problem, in American foreign policy dating back to Cold War. As Glenn mentioned, I played a role in Afghanistan, and a great victory turned into a big problem because of the lack of follow-up after the Cold War. So, I think it's mostly that it's opened up another theater for them, but I don't think in the grand, it's not the singular failure. I would argue that failure to take more decisive action in Syria, the opposite side of the problem, has had equally or greater strategic effect than what we did in Libya. But Libya certainly, and yet the Yemen case that I talked about, where we didn't back our partner against the takeover of the regime by a minority, I would say that was probably a bigger failure, because Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is a more dangerous group. They've got very advanced bomb-making technology and others, and so you don't have that yet in Libya. You could down the road. It's never good to, leave a mess and have a safe haven. I mean, that's the bottom line of counterterrorism. Yeah, so the broader question, yeah. Well, we don't, I mean, there was a real fear of a big massacre, and a lot of the policy officials saw what happened in Africa in the 90s and were scarred by that, and that was on their mind. I mean, I was there the day the president made the decision, and so.
Okay, last question for Michael. We're going to have to wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Sorry we got limited time here.
I'm Michael Ryan at Jamestown. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I thought that with ideology, my personal opinion was that, and it's not down in the State Department in any sense, but that you can't, the United States can't engage these guys directly and argue about ideological things. It just doesn't work.
Right.
And we tend to separate soft power and hard power. And it strikes me that ideology is the one. I thought you were saying it without saying those words. That you have to have a fusion of those efforts.
Yes.
You have to have hard efforts, and you have to have
Yeah.
the softer side of it, and they have to somehow. And that's what we don't have right now. I don't think we don't have a way to kind of have them work together, in the same, pulling the same cart down the road rather than going in different directions.
Yeah, and I would add the third point, which you just said, is also you have to be willing to play a supporting role, and amplify their voices and not try to. You're not going to win the center of the debate.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll take one more question. It's almost 11. Gentleman in the back has been patiently waiting, and then we'll have to break it off. So we've already gone over a little bit.
God, you guys are tougher on me than HR.
Yeah.
And I'm a recovering policymaker.
My name is Andre Tesh with Myopia. You mentioned 3.0 earlier, and although we have a lot of uncertainties when it comes to 3.0, there's one thing we can be certain about. A lot of it is going to be digital. What are we doing today to prepare for that side of the fight? It's easy for one person from a corner of a bedroom to create an uprising somewhere through a computer, and then millions of people die. It's starting to happen. We do know that if we can win the battle on that side, it's going to be 50, 75% that we will have won. Now, second quick question. HR mentioned earlier about one of our allies in Europe taking the lead in Africa. With what happened in Libya recently, one would think that wherever on earth that a human being is being sold, the United States has automatic jurisdiction. When will we start taking the lead in Africa? When will we stop having other people take the lead? We count on them, and yet we don't see a result that is what we would have gotten ourselves had we moved in. Thank you.
So I mean, we do take the lead in Somalia, which has, kind of been the original incubator of regional terrorism on the continent. The French did a very, very good job in northern Mali, in reversing the gains that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and other groups had made. And we supported them in that. Libya has been the problem that, it was a NATO war, but then after the war was won, everybody kind of disengaged. And it's been harder to get folks to take ownership of that. But, and so then if you go around the Horn, the U.S. now doing more in parts of the Sahel and in Libya, and then, enabling partners in Nigeria and Cameroon and Burkina Faso against the Boko Haram threat. So, it's a mixture, but African Union has done a pretty good job in Somalia for us over time. So, partners are important. U.S. can't be everywhere.
That's true. All right, on that note, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having Michael speak to